Greetings everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, I'm going to be discussing the topic of American slavery, as well as Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, which is one of the cornerstones of American literature. Of anything that we're going to read in this class, Frederick Douglass's narrative is probably the most important thing as far as getting an understanding of literature before the Civil War, as far as understanding American life before the Civil War, as well as just getting a great hero story. We talked about Benjamin Franklin's autobiography a couple of weeks ago, but here with Frederick Douglass, we're also getting a sort of American dream story of sorts, right? Except it's even more powerful because he escapes clutches of slavery and actually becomes a very successful person, as we'll talk about. Before we get to the narrative, I just wanted to touch on the topic of slavery in general. Okay. So let me just go to this Word document. As I mentioned in a video before, that America was going through vast changes in the early 19th century. And it was changes based on a regional difference. And in the northern, of course, when the Constitution was ratified, the slave trade was outlawed, meaning that you couldn't import slaves from Africa anymore. So they depended on slaves having children to keep the trade going. Of course, as Frederick Douglass tells us, lots of times masters would have children with their own slaves and then sell the children into slavery. But a little bit of context is in order to see what was going on with it up until about the Civil War politically. As I mentioned to you before, that the South became an agricultural society based off of raw goods, right? So they would ship off tobacco. They would, it's called King Cotton because they would ship off cotton, to Europe. I think I saw a stat saying that 75% of all U.S. exports to other countries came from the South. Almost most of the money in the country came from the southern states, so they wielded a great deal of power in that regard. The northern states, of course, became more of a manufacturing type of society. And so different states on a state-by-state basis outlawed the practice of slavery as time went on. But as the country kept growing and expanding westward, we'll start with Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase. Then we just, over the course of the next 30 or 40 years, we just keep going west until we get to California. And over those next few decades, I told you guys before, when we admit new states to the Union, we had to have a balancing act of sorts. We can't have more free states than slave states. We can't have more slave states than free states, because otherwise the balance of power will go to one side of the country over the other. So just some political things here. In 1820, we had the Missouri Compromise. Missouri becomes a slave state. Maine becomes a free state. One of the key big issues, this was happening when Douglass was plotting his escape, was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1832. And so Nat Turner's rebellion, of course, was the first great slave uprising that led to lots of death, to say the least. But Nat Turner's rebellion kind of put a little bit of fear in the slave owners that, hey, this can happen at any time, so we have to be vigilant. But as the century progressed, we went into the Mexican War and gained a lot of territory from Mexico. So states like Texas, moving on to California. And we had to come up with this kind of balancing act, and it just kept getting worse and worse, as tensions escalated. In the northern states, you had the abolitionist movement, which started. Of course, Frederick Douglass's narrative, was a key text within that abolitionist movement. So led by people like William Lloyd Garrison, these slave narratives and things like that, were texts used to showcase the evils of slavery. But we kept growing as a country, so what did we do? The Compromise of 1850 was an omnibus bill. They tried to pack a lot of stuff into one bill, basically. It settled slavery after the gains of the Mexican War. So you can read more about that if you want, but it did give new states a lot of freedom to decide whether they wanted to become slave states or not. But the South kind of gained an upper hand in the Compromise of 1850 because they got something passed in it called the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed slave owners to go north to reclaim their property, right? So this caused a lot of anger and upheaval, right? Because suddenly you had these guys in the South coming north, saying, hey, this person who's been working at this factory for 10 years, he's my runaway slave. I'm going to take him back with me. And the law said that they could do it. And of course, lots of times they didn't have proof, right, that that person was the slave. So they could just make stuff up. And so, anger, hostility in the air in 1850. Then we had the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. You guys have probably heard of Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln's debates. Stephen Douglas was the senator who helped pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. He said that states should have popular sovereignty to decide whether they want slavery or not. Basically, let's leave it up to the people in the state to decide. Of course, this led to more violence because John Brown actually went through Kansas and murdered a lot of slaveholding interests. But over the next 5 years, tension just kept building. We had an ineffective president named James Buchanan just before Lincoln, who refused to do anything about the issue at all. But by the time we got to 1860, everything had come to a boiling point. Of course, we had John Brown's raid of Harper's Ferry, where he raided Harper's Ferry, trying to arm the slaves. But it came to a point where the South said, that this guy, Abraham Lincoln, by the way, didn't start the Civil War out wanting to free the slaves. He started the Civil War out wanting to send the slaves back to Africa. The main thing that he wanted to do was preserve the Union. Right? It didn't matter if slavery still continued or not. Once his mind changed over the next couple of years, but just as a point of interest, Lincoln did not start the war out thinking slavery had to be outlawed per se. But he wasn't exactly completely friendly to slavery. So a lot of the slave states said, hey, if this guy gets elected, we're going to secede from the Union. And of course, it happened. The Civil War starts. Let me make one thing perfectly clear. And one thing needs to be made perfectly clear. If anyone tells you that the Civil War was about that slavery was not the main cause of the Civil War, they're a fool. Okay, they're a complete and utter fool. The slavery was the main issue that caused the Civil War. Lots of people say that it was states' rights, like the South. The South in particular, you know, thought that the federal government was impinging on their rights as states. Well, sure, that was a part of it, but it was their rights to own slaves that was at question. You guys don't believe me, maybe you've heard differently at other points in your lives. Google some slavery secession documents. Secession, Secession, especially South Carolinas. Read South Carolinas. Secession documents, the people, they write, we're disavowing their connection to the United States. And in pretty much all of them, especially South Carolinas, they say we're doing this because they're infringing on our rights to own slaves. So again, if anybody tells you that it was about anything besides slavery, they're a fool. And there's plenty of fools who are teachers. Okay. So take it from me, Dr. Yeager. Right? That was the main issue. If anybody says differently, they're an idiot. A logical fallacy, by the way, but this is a case where a logical fallacy is true. But anyway, let's move the conversation to Douglass. Let's go back to me. Frederick Douglass's narrative was one of many slave narratives that were published by the abolitionist movement. Of course, Douglass became probably one of the leading voices of anti-slavery. He started out under the banner of William Lloyd Garrison. Of course, different abolitionists disagreed about how to handle the topic of slavery. If you read in our Norton intro to Douglass, it actually goes into detail talking about Garrison and Douglass's rift, how they sort of split on the issue. But Douglass became a leading lecturer. As I mentioned to you guys before, lecturing became a big thing that people did to pass the time, go to lectures. But as the century progressed, Douglass lived up into the 1890s. And as the century progressed, not only did he have a leading voice in slavery, ending slavery, but he also had a leading voice in criticizing what happened after the Civil War. Of course, Reconstruction in the South. The government really didn't. Sure, slavery was outlawed, but the slave culture in the South still was there. They didn't change it. That's a topic for another day. But he spoke out against that. He spoke out against lynching. Douglass was a hero for the African American community. He actually even had an audience with President Lincoln by the time the Civil War got here. Now, just as a little bit about the text itself, there's many slave narratives, just like that there was many Native American captivity narratives. We read the captivity narrative of Mary Rowlandson. Well, that was probably the most popular one. Just as Douglass's here, was probably one of the most widely read. It says in our Norton that it sold over 20,000 copies, which, as I told you guys before, that was a big deal in America because mass pirating happened. So you might ask yourself, why is Douglass's narrative so popular? Why is it the one we usually gravitate to? There's plenty of other ones out there. You can read. There's one called Clotel. There's one called 12 Years a Slave, which they actually just made a film about a couple of years ago. There was many of them. But Douglass gives us, a wide glimpse into the institution, what he thinks causes the institution of slavery to tick. Okay. Let's go back to our Word document. What are some key themes in Douglass's narrative? One of them, of course, is just highlighting the cruelty of slavery. We could talk about different passages, in the text, but there's almost more than one instance, right? He talks about how his different masters as he was growing up, beat, how they whipped their slaves for no reason. He talks about how when one slave didn't want to be beaten, he went to the river so that the overseer couldn't get him. Right? And then, the overseer shot the slave who was being rebellious. And when asked why, he said that if you give them 1 inch, they're going to take an L, right? So it's like saying if you give them 1 inch, they're going to take a mile, pretty much. So whenever we're saying the cruelty of slavery, we should probably be more specific. So violence against them, cruelty of slaves being removed from their families, right? When a child slave was born, he or she was often sold to be away from the mother because they didn't want the slave child to have a bond with the mother, because that's a bond that could be dangerous. And so lots of the depravities, come about as a result of the slave institution. The next one is literacy. All right, so one of the things that Douglass talks about early, is how he was fortunate that when he went to Baltimore to work, of course he started off on a really awful plantation, but then he was fortunate to be able to go to Baltimore to be a house slave. When he was there, his mistress, taught him the alphabet. All right. Of course, once the mistress's husband found out, that he forbid her from teaching him anymore. So Douglass's narrative goes into the importance of literacy for slaves. Slave owners liked to keep their slaves dark. In the dark, as far as knowledge. If they became self-aware of their condition, if they read ideas from different people, that could cause them to be discontent. Right? That could cause them to want to run away, or realize the injustices that are being done to them. So it was important then for the slave owners to keep their slaves from being able to read. Now, needless to say, there were some who could read. Lots of times, if you had a really big plantation, you had a slave who would maybe do the plantation's books, for instance. But for the most part, reading and slavery did not go hand in hand. Douglass even talks about the sort of ways he did learn to read. Right? Once he knew the alphabet, nothing was going to stop him. So he would do things like get little books from the other children, little things to read. But he taught, after learning the alphabet, he pretty much taught himself how to read, which was an amazing thing, to say the least, that he taught himself how to do that. And it shows how smart of a man he was. But even once, Douglass even talks about once he does learn how to read, it becomes a curse almost to him too, because it makes him even more unhappy. Right? It makes him realize how awfully he had it. The literacy, slaves could not be able to read without forming dangerous ideas. Another theme in the text is Christianity and slavery. And so Douglass goes to great lengths to talk about, especially at the appendix, right? But at several points, he talks about how could it be that someone who could claim to be a Christian could also be such a monster when it comes to owning slaves, right? The worst character he runs into in the book, was not character, real person, was Mr. Covey. Right? Mr. Covey was a Methodist minister, who was known for having a reputation for breaking slaves down and making them, and degrading them to the point that they no longer had any pride. Well, how could a man who did all these terrible things, how could he go to the pulpit and preach? Right? Slave owners in the South used biblical justifications for owning slaves. They came up with almost anything they could think of. Douglass mentions that one of them was, the story of Ham, right? After the Noah's Ark story, Noah's son Ham is cursed by God. You go back and read the Genesis story for that. But they say that the curse of Ham, right, was the curse, put upon the African peoples. So lots of even just basic one-line verses they would use. Like, for instance, the one about, with one, he talks about how one person used a verse from Luke, right, to say if your servant, if your servant doesn't comply with what you want, whip them. And so Douglass is especially critical about, the institution of slavery with Christianity. Of course, Christianity was, of course, used in the abolitionist movement to also show how slavery was wrong. But Southerners tried to twist the Bible in any way that they could to justify the institution. And so he talks about that. He talks about this is the main thing that I want to touch on. Is self-reliance. All right, we talked about Emerson last week, but I ask you guys, this is a question that's on the midterm. Is there a more self-reliant person than Douglass? Right? This is literally one of the most amazing sort of rags and riches stories. And part of it comes from his own ingenuity and self-reliance. He didn't rely on anyone else, teaching him how to read. He learned how to do so himself. After a while, he got sick of the demeaning things that he had to endure. So eventually, he took a stand and didn't have to put up with as much physical violence as he once did. The key passage in the text is his fight with Mr. Cody. And that's on page 1203 of our text. He talks about, so let's take a look at 1203. But the main, of course, you guys know about Covey, right? He's this guy who's supposed to break the slaves. He just treats Douglass. He finds any way that he can to whip Douglass. But eventually, of course, after Douglass runs away, he comes back. He uses some kind of string that's superstitious to say that nothing bad will happen if you carry the string. But Covey acts fine until a couple of days later. He tries to bait Douglass. He trips him and tries to beat him. Douglass has enough, and fights Covey. He actually says that he and Covey fight for over 2 hours. As Covey tries to get one of his fellow people to help, Douglass knocks him out. Then Covey tries to get other slaves to help, and the other slaves say, "Covey, you're on your own." But Douglass stands up to Covey. After this incident, Covey no longer tests Douglass anymore. And so Douglass says, "Well, he could have sent me to the public whipping place, but what would happen? He would lose his reputation as being a breaker of slaves. If word got around that a slave got the better of him, he would lose his great reputation." So this whole incident kind of showcases, right? It kind of showcases the power dynamics that take place. I'll even put this as its own theme. The loose power dynamics that happen between slaves and owners. Right? Douglass almost becomes Covey's master here, right? Because Douglass understood this power dynamic. And then once he took the power from Covey was left defenseless almost if he wanted to keep his living. At any time, right, especially on these big plantations, there were more slaves on a plantation than there was, white people. Right? So, at any point, if all the slaves gathered together, they could have taken charge of the situation. Right? Of course, later on, and they might get called up to, but at any point they could say enough, and reject it. So he also talks about how at Christmas time, Christmas to New Year was the 1 week of the year that the slave owners, gave to the slaves to take off. But they encouraged things like getting drunk. They wanted the slaves to lay around the whole week drunk. Douglass says that they did this because they wanted the slaves to realize that, hey, a little bit of freedom isn't what you make it out to be. Right? If you just lay around drunk, you're going to become unhappy. Then by the time you get back from New Year, you're happy to get back to work again because you laid around in this awful state of mind. So lots of Of course, I'm with the literacy issue too. We see that this whole balancing act between slave and owner, was a tenuous one, to say the least. There was actually a South Carolina senator. I'll give you guys this little detail. This will come up later when we read the story Bartleby the Scrivener. But there was actually a South Carolina named James Henry Hammond who came up with a theory called the mudsill theory. So Southerners would come up with stuff like this all the time to justify the institution of slavery. And the mudsill theory, he says, in every civilized society, there must be a class of people to do the dirty work. In the South, slaves are, of course he says this, slaves are fed and treated well. In the North, the free slaves are the people working in the factories for little wages. So Hammond pretty much says, like you said, in every society, somebody's got to do the job nobody else wants to do. Somebody's got to be the grave digger. Right? Somebody's got to pick. Like I said, picking cotton was hard work. Right? Somebody's got to do that. Somebody's got to work these jobs in these factories. Hammond's argument was, in the South, we treat our slaves well, right? We feed them. But in the North, you have poor laborers who are getting mangled in factories, who are not making enough money to support their children. Right? And these, Hammond says, up north, your slaves can vote. Right? So Hammond even kind of insinuates, hey, in the North, you're eventually going to get to a point where there's going to be labor wars. Of course, he wasn't wrong about that, right? The Industrial Revolution, workers getting rights, things like the 8-hour day, 40 hours a week, not having child laborers. Those things had to come with time and lots of exertion. So both sides would thus sort of go back and forth at each other. Like I told you guys before too, there was lots of Southern literature too that's not often read that also sort of argues for the institution of slavery. Lots of times the works of William Gilmore Simms, was works that justified slavery. We also have other sort of key texts in the abolitionist movement too. We're not reading any of Uncle Tom's Cabin. But Uncle Tom's Cabin was a book that sort of inflamed the abolitionist crowd when it came out. Lincoln said it was the little book that caused the war. It's a little bit of a long book. That's why we don't get to the whole length of it in this course. But anyway, that's just a little bit to introduce Douglass. Like I said, I can't stress enough how central of a figure he is in an American Lit course. Especially putting him into conversation with some of these other writers we're reading. So you might ask yourself, well, how does Emerson's ideas translate over to Douglass? Emerson's a guy who didn't really do anything but talk. How did his ideas translate over? How does Douglass compare with Thoreau, whose Walden we're reading next week? So these are transcendentalism had, for the most part, a hostility against slavery. So these are issues to consider. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Hopefully that helped illuminate some themes in the Douglass narrative. Until next time, take care.